And now for the special treat of the day. Kathleen Wakefield is going to lead us in a session called Songs Planted in Clay. She will introduce us to the session in just a moment, but first let me introduce you to her. Kathleen is the author of 2 books of poetry. She is a teacher of poetry as well, but in her books, she focuses on natural beauty, on deep meanings. And the 2 books are Notations on the Visible World, and that particular book was the winner of the Ninga Prize for Poetry. And the other book is Grip, Give, and Sway. What an intriguing title. She holds degrees from Mount Holyoke College in chemistry, and she holds a degree from the University of Michigan in art. I mention those in particular because you get an idea about the range of her knowledge and her interests. She has a deep curiosity. She is a philosophical thinker as well as a poetic thinker and creator. And she is going to teach us today. She has taught creative writing at Eastman School of Music and the University of Rochester. She's worked as a poet in the schools and she shares poetry still in many venues, including public libraries and so forth. You can read the rest of her bio here on the screen, but what I want to add is that Kathleen has an insatiable curiosity, and she has an integrative mind. So in conversations, you will find that she's able to traverse many different areas of thinking. And we are in for a great treat today as she shares some of her poetry and the project that she did in the Process Studies certificate program. Welcome, welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. What a very kind introduction. And it's thank you for inviting me. It really is an enormous privilege to be here in front of you all. And in front of a group and an organization that has nourished me so much. The presentation is really based on the my work for the certificate program. And I'm going to begin with the words of former poet laureate Stanley Kunitz, who's one of my favorite poets. And this is where the subtitle Songs of Clay come from in my title. He wrote in his 1985 essay, The Wisdom of the Body, "In my philosophy, all 3, mind, body, and spirit, are merely stages of incandescence, awareness of the same organism." We can go on to the next slide because this will give us a little chance to look at this. As the lights go on within, we begin to see that everything that happens impinging on us. Our most sublime thoughts have their feet planted in clay. Our best songs are body songs. Here we have a poet's process philosophy in a nutshell. Instead of Whiteheadian concrescences, Kunitz speaks of stages of incandescence in the organism's awareness. No bifurcation of mind and body here. The poet's vocation is to think and feel and sing from the whole. As a poet entering the world of process studies, I found in Matt Segal's words a further grounding and inspiration for my writing and this project. He asserts that the modern ontological bifurcation separating the physical from the psychical can be healed only through an aesthetic act of creative imagination, an act that allows us not only to think, but by thinking organically, also feel the world in a new way. This certainly spoke to me as a poet, but I think it speaks to all artists. And there are many acts of creative imagination that aren't art, but that are also aesthetic acts that could be healing. We know how much Whitehead loved the Romantic poets for the way they captured the spirit and dynamic flow of nature and its value and interconnectedness, especially in landscape. But I wondered how, in this 21st century, what it would mean to more intentionally pursue a deeply embodied poetry, seeking to describe the withness, the moments of being in deep relationship with the animate and unanimate world, especially as a person who at times feels some dislocation from this. I wondered, could poetry serve as what Mary Elizabeth calls a practical wisdom for inspiring us to save what's left of nature? Writing, of course, is an exemplification of creativity, what Whitehead names as the universal of universals, characterizing ultimate matter of fact. Poets are inspired by and draw deeply from the causal efficacy of the body, all of its inheritances, its visceral feelings and memories of past occasions of experience, as it combines them with the immediate sensory datum, the prehension of conceptual feelings and propositional lures into an act of decision-making and transformation into something new to be taken back up into the lived and unfolding life. To be fully conscious of all of these elements would stultify the flow of writing, as if putting a rock in the middle of a stream. And yet, I would like to suggest that the poet works more consciously than is usually thought with those bodily inheritances, what has been labeled the more primitive mode of perception, and whose importance Whitehead acknowledged and appreciated, unlike many of his predecessors, leading the way for healing the bifurcation of nature. This project is not an argument for process thought supplied by art, nor art needing to be affirmed by process. Whitehead saw them as kin. Philosophy is the endeavor to find conventional phraseology for the vivid suggestiveness of poets. This is a plea for the liberating and healing power of Whiteheadian metaphysics through the process of artistic creation and meaning making. There's no escaping that every poet bears within her a cosmology, acknowledged or not. Every poet witnesses the way the world is experienced over time, experimented and tinkered with by playing with the material at hand, language, the possibilities of space and time suggested by the page, by living voice and breath. Poetry is a music-making device. Like many of you, I've been long haunted by the relation between body and mind, the split between religion and science, the nature of time and the emergence of values. And thus, like many of you, I found that Whitehead's medical system, medical system, I don't know, it's healing, certainly, deepen the sources and reach of my poetic efforts, drew newness out of the lived and writing life, enlarged the dimensions of wonder, and exhausted hope and faith. Here is a bit of this story. First, I'd like to step back to a poem which I wrote probably a couple of years before I started more serious study of process thought. And I see in it now inklings of process, of thinking along these lines. I created a number of years ago a persona, a poetic persona I call the invisible stenographer, and I've written several poems about her. She is an archivist of unrecorded events. She's a time traveler. She's sometimes invisible because she's a woman. Sometimes she's visible and living in disguise among the living. Sometimes she's not human. Her origins are unknown even to herself. She is a perpetual witness to suffering. And at this point in her story, after these many poems I've written, she's on the verge of putting down her pen because she's discouraged. And she wonders how and if at all, love and beauty are woven into the fabric of the universe. wrote a poem called The Dream of the Invisible Stenographer. And this started because of a sort of a vision I had one night falling asleep. You know, as you fall asleep, you kind of go into a semi-hallucinatory state. And this image of her came to mind. And I kind of purposely lived with it. I stayed with it and wrote this poem. So I'm going to start kind of in the middle of the poem. But at this point in the poem, she dreams that her body has become the earth, and vice versa, that the earth has become her body. So we begin here. She finds herself, quote, tattooed with a beautiful confusion of mountains, roads, switchbacks, blue ice fields marbling her flesh, scarred valleys, canyons, tundra, granite-rimmed northern rivers, dry desert wadis circle her belly and hips. Archipelagos sprawl down her arms, over her shoulders and breasts, swaths of forest swirl. She curls into a ball and spins. From her eyes, a wild downpour spills, a saltwater flood, a deluge of tears, washing every color from her skin. Indigo, ochre, azure, brown, basalt, sea green, and vermilion rivers running off her until she's transparent as a fish's egg on a river bottom, until she's clear as a lens through which she can see all the way back to a field of stars. Now, eventually, later in the poem, she slips into the deep structure of the universe. What she takes to be love, Sufi dancers, matter and dark matter whirling around each other, invisible cloths whose seamless billowing she can nonetheless see. An intricate script scrawled fine-like over the infinitely unfolding fabric, which she imagines is love writing itself into becoming, until everywhere she sees dangling threads ready to unravel and break open all possibility, darkness, light. Later, I wondered how this image of infinitely unfolding fabric with threads always ready to unravel and break open all possibility might relate to Whitehead's vision of God for the world, quote, the particular providence for particular occasions, drawing forth and flowing into each concrescent occasion of experience. And then later, while I was in the process studies course, I was struck by Matthew Segal's description of how Whitehead's, and we can move to the next, oh, maybe I have the wrong order. There's one for Matt a little before this. I'll just read it anyway. This is a different quote, but that one right here, yes. Okay. He writes, the modern ontological bifurcation separating the physical from the psychical can be healed only through an aesthetic act of creative imagination. Oh, you know what? My apologies here. I have a couple quotes, and this is one that only I have in my paper. My apologies here. These are his words here, and they are not what's on the screen. He describes how Whitehead's, quote, theory of a prehensively coordinated plurality of spacetimes implies a fraying fabric always in the process of being repaired by the bipolar physical mental concrescences of organismic occasions of experience. That's quite a mouthful, I know, to take in, but I bring it up because it spoke to me. And also I found it fascinating that the fabric in my poem, Infinitely Unfolding with Dangling Threads, seemed to be complemented by the fabric always fraying in his poetic writing, a shared archetypal image, a poetic intuition of reality that hints at its dynamic nature. To try to subject what I wrote to really Whitehead's metaphysics would really not work. It's simply a dream, and such an analysis would rip out the heart of the poem and tie it to a set of ideas. Such restraints would diminish the adventurousness of art, always pressing beyond its bounds. But most important, unbeknownst to the invisible stenographer, to me, the groundwork had been laid for the Whiteheadian journey. Now, for years, I had always thought of myself as a poet who wrote about nature. But increasingly, I had been thinking about what does that mean to write about nature? And so I spent some time looking at the etymology of that word about, whose meanings persist in time. They don't change very much. So I'll just read a little bit of this from a dictionary. It starts out from the Middle English word about, on the outside of, around the circumference of, enveloping, in the vicinity of, hither and thither, or near in time, number, degree, approximately. Later, in the 14th century, around in a circular course, round and around on every side, so as to surround, also engaged in, and so on and so on. And so I thought, the idea of nearness is really good. So too, viewing from different directions, engaged with, but all implying a separation between object and subject, observer and observed. I found myself increasingly wanting to write in new ways from inside this body, inside the body of the cosmos, with a deep awareness at the most personal level of the widthness and thickness of that experience. And yet, trying not to do it in simply anthropomorphic terms. Now, we could go off on another tangent here talking about anthropomorphic language, which would be a really interesting discussion to have. Is it a form of colonization, or is it a way of expressing kinship with the animate and inanimate world? Is it a way of honoring the notion of feeling all the way down? I think it can go both ways. In any event, I was wondering how to experience and express with language, because language is an experience itself. It isn't something that's separate from it. It is an experience. The immanence of the world that, quote, in a certain sense, everywhere, everything is everywhere at all times. I thought a lot about this language issue, thinking about how different languages do things differently. The linguist Lyra Boroditsky says, language shapes even the most fundamental dimensions of human experience, space, time, causality. That in itself is another subject to explore. And anyway, as I pondered these things, I also wondered, what validity do my own words have coming from my small experience? We can go to the next slide, please. This is Andrew Davis's words. Although you remain very small, your experience is actually very big, because it expresses the same principles that reign throughout nature in various intensities. Although your experience is immanent to yourself, it also transcends you because it is connected to the entire cosmos as a whole. And so this gave me courage to keep going with this project, still wondering what it really means to, quote, think organically. Feeling and expressing the deep connections with the cosmos, with the natural world, would seem to to require the deployment of imaginative sympathies, of letting go of the sole perspective of self, and perhaps a reversal of viewpoint. I'm going to read a poem about mosses. I've always loved mosses. I love to touch them. I feel greatly comforted by them. I like to try to identify them, but I'm not very good at it. And I got thinking about this act of naming, which can be a form of control and classification, but it can also be a form of endearment, of intimacy, of honoring, as in the naming of a child. I was always wondering if, I was actually disturbing the moss, seeking something from them that maybe they couldn't give, that I wanted. And so I got thinking about the moss's experience and whether my seeking communion resulted in some kind of unintended violation. So I wrote a poem called Naming the Moss, in which the moss is the speaker. It's from the perspective of the moss. And you in the poem, the moss is speaking to you, is the human who named and touched it. Naming the moss. You lean over me, sighing. I'd like to think your naming is a kind of cherishing, but there is so little you know about me. You can't decide what to call me. At first, Polycomium splendens, meaning splendid hemlock in miniature. Little stream on the tongue, like the one that runs rock-riddled through these woods. You offer a gala of names, splendid feather moss, glittering wood moss, mountain fern moss, which all depend on what you see, and staircase moss, my favorite for the way I grow myself, each new stem stepping atop the old. You can count and climb my years, the kind of thing you like to do. Tell me, am I one or one of many? Can you love a colony? Fox and ground beetle pass over me lightly. You might take instruction from them. I know you want to be gentle. The touch of your fingertips rougher than you think. Your cells sloughed off on me, souvenir of our time together. I wanted to believe in a shared moment of intimacy with the moss. I feel something, but I'm not sure what the truth of it is. At best, I can express reverence for it. I wanted to somehow evoke Moss's wisdom and imagine some kind of response to the naive, sometimes thoughtless, but well-intentioned human. And then I began thinking of going a little deeper, maybe going more in the direction of exploring imaginatively the inner processes of another living being, of chlorophyll inside a leaf. So this next poem, entitled Chlorophyll, tries to do that. The way I generated this poem, sometimes giving yourself a little challenge or a little structure is helpful, even though it can be challenging. The beginning of each line, and these are really long lines, are the letters of the word chlorophyll. The first line begins with C, the next one with H and L. So that's how I got this going. And remember, when you see green, that's the light that you're seeing, and the light that's being absorbed by the leaf is red and blue. Chlorophyll cleaves to red and blue, intimate marriage of molecule to light. Letting go the green our eyes hunger for, they drink. Though we'd grow dizzy, could we gaze inside each swaying leaf? Lilliputian, tremulous, chloroplasts stacked in tiny flasks in a distillery whose fires we can't hear. Oracular, wind-riffled leaves prophesy sweetness, cloaking the unheard infinitesimal roar of chlorophyll's electrons within. Light-struck, ecstatic, they leap from molecule to molecule in oceans of enzymes, swirl of minerals, carbon dioxide, sparking a chemical dance, reactions light and dark, pouring sugar and sap into the world, into leaves lobed, needled, heart-like, waxy, hirsute, silky, Earth's hip flasks, quietly bubbling oxygen into air. We sweep unthinkingly, yet cannot live without. Being yield, we lift to our lips, we taste. Chlorophyll, reader of light, who cannot read our lips. How do we make our praise to you luminous? I didn't realize until the end that I wanted to make the words into light, a kind of hymn of praise that the chlorophyll could receive. And this is the thing about writing poetry. It is a process with a lot of possibilities and an endpoint that you don't know. That's part of the joy of doing it, that it's very open-ended. I wanted to reenact for human eyes and ears the life-sustaining energies of the green world. And this matters to me. In our current ecological crisis, as someone who supposedly writes about nature, I would like to think that poetry and the arts have the potential to, quote, not only re-enchant nature as a divine wilderness, but also reorient human purpose as participation and world loyalty. Those are the words also of Andrew Davis. And I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about metaphor, because I think they're a wonderful way of really realizing why poetry works so well to bring together the inner and outer worlds and heal this bifurcation between man and nature. Metaphors offer unexpected flashes of insight that fuse things that seem like they're unlike, and gives rise to new understandings that ripple through a poem. The poet Mary Ruefle has written some beautiful things about metaphor. She says, a poem must rival, yet thank you so much for putting that up. She says that a poem must rival a physical experience, and metaphor is simply an exchange of energy between two things. She continues, if you believe that metaphor is an event, doesn't this sound like Whitehead? And not just a literary term denoting comparison, then you must conclude that a certain philosophy arises, the philosophy that everything is connected. It unites the world by its very premise that things connect and exchange energy. I can't recommend her book, Madness, Rack, and Honey more. It's a wonderful book. So here we are with Mary Ruefle, Stanley Kunitz before. We're back to a poet's process philosophy. Metaphors and poetry, by energetically weaving together sound and image, the physical and psychical, the inner and outer worlds expressed in time, aligns itself with Whitehead's assertion that the real things of the world are actual occasions. Poetry's music is energy, embodied, born of voice. It carries along the re-experiencing of the world and the self, sparking new connections. It mingles past and present with the anticipation of what comes next. Still, large questions for me remained, and they're huge questions for us all. What is nature? And what is it to be human in it? Go to the next slide. Whitehead says, we think of ourselves as so intimately entwined in bodily life that a man is a complex unity, body and mind. But the body is part of the external world, continuous with it. In fact, it is as much a part of nature as anything else there, a river, a mountain, or cloud. Also, if we are fussily exact, we cannot define where a body begins and ends. The poem Fen Walk was inspired by an actual event. I went on a hike with a naturalist and a group of people to a bog and a fen. And before I had gone on this, I had been reading David Hinton's books. He's a translator of ancient Chinese poetry, and his book, Awakened Cosmos, is a really beautiful book. It's actually the translations of the poet Tu Fu. And he is able to, in his essays in the book and in the translations, really capture the Taoist vision. So I put together these two experiences and used Hinton's quote as a way of beginning the poem, or it's an epigram for the poem. Hinton writes, the cosmos turned toward itself once again, eventually giving shape to consciousness. That spatiality, the eye's mirror transparency, conjures inside animals. The material universe, which had been perfectly opaque, was now open to itself, awakened to itself. I found such a fantastic thought, the cosmos looking at itself as it was making itself. But I thought, after going on this fen walk, is it just seeing? Is seeing the only way for the cosmos to be aware of itself? What about the other senses, taste and touch? Fen walk. And what of touch? A naturalist we gathered around as she plunged fist into fen to measure the peat's thickness and feel, then placed its grainy wetness on her tongue. When she tasted fen, what did she see? Become. Then she rose up and found for us yellow lady slippers rising sister-like on their island clumps, radiant water nymphs. The men knelt down and saw themselves. I don't know whether they actually saw themselves, but I had a deep feeling of us all experiencing and seeing something of ourselves in this bog and fen. The boundaries were kind of erased. The next question that arose for me is, how do we receive the wisdom of nature, which is also in our own bodies? And then, who and what do our words belong to? And this poem was striking more at the heart of that question is, how do we think organically? I mean, words aren't the only way to think and feel organically, but that's the way I do it primarily. The title of this poem is, Whose Body Do These Words Belong To? I'm trying to think with my body, meditate with my tongue on the crushed sassafras leaf, its green erudition, piquant, sweet. My fingers trace devotion in the slow silvered walk of lichen over stone, algae and fungi entwined in stubborn embrace. I'm overtaken by honeysuckle's rampant perfume, the swell of sex, funk of the opossum's split belly, the body already becoming something else, until the warbling vireo's quavering song, scandal of beauty, spills into the air, a kind of mercy. I tell you these things because inside I'm a prairie fire, half contained, slow burn, charred earth that wants to be worked again and again. Is the I really transformed in some way in this poem? I have a lot of questions, whether I'm just creating something or if that experience is really there. It is my experience. I don't know if it's true or not. Is the rift between human and natural worlds healed in some way? Or is this just a dream, an evocation of longing? What I did come to see in writing this, though, is the feeling that the words of the speaker, even at their most faltering, are a kind of earth speech too. An evocation of what Whitehead said is a work of art be considered a fragment of nature. Or in Merleau-Ponty's words, quote, authentic speech is the presence of thought in the world, not its garment, but its body. Poetry shares much with Whitehead's theory of prehensions, and so too embodies a protest against the bifurcation of nature. The poet's always receiving influences, prehensions of its inherited past, of conceptual aims, the potentialities relevant to the current situation, the sensory datum of the present moment, along with the entity's own subjective aims, which allow for novelty as the poetic experience actualizes itself. We can move to the next quote. Whitehead wrote, every prehension, the taking in of all everything that we're taking in, internally, externally, every prehension has a private and public side. Its public side is constituted by the complete datum prehended, and its private side is constituted by the subjective form through which a private quality is imposed on that public datum. Actualities are moments of passage into the novel stage of publicity, and the coordination of prehensions expresses the publicity of the world, so far as it can be considered in abstraction from private genesis. Prehensions have public careers, but they are born privately. Poems are born privately from public prehensions. Finally, I got to a place in my project that I really didn't expect to get to. And it was much more personal, and it's a little more difficult to share, but I think it's something that could provide hope for other people. And so I'm willing to do that. I think of this as process excavations. I started exploring the relationship between emotional and spiritual wholeness of self and the integration of the human into nature. So my own journey toward wholeness and my own love of nature. Early on in my life, I experienced trauma, among other things. While I had long found consolation, beauty, and belonging in nature, the wholeness I never felt complete. Riven is a poem I wrote about walking on a wooded esker. An esker is a glacial feature. The esker goes high up. There's a valley on either side, and this is a wooded esker. The esker really is the remains of the sand and the gravel, and it's a really extraordinarily beautiful landscape that I like to go to. So this poem describes trying to bring my wounds, or not trying to, but simply bringing them into that landscape. I think it's something many of us do. We simply take our feelings and we go to nature for consolation. Riven with unfinished reckonings, I go into the deep woods where all light is consequential. My history dwindles. A maple dressed in moss holds my gaze like a deeply loved face. How speak to a tree whose twisted furrows of bark hold the memory of wind's contortions, the weight of many snows? No birds sing in this midday hour. On either side of the path, toppled limbs lie across each other, exquisite wreckage. And my own? Can I lay it down here where sunflecks strike patches of ground? Small radiances that seem to burn from within the earth. All around me, the untongued grammar of root, rock, air, supple, unfixed, humming. I recognize the wood's wreckage as life-giving, as certainly it is. Trees break down, insects come in, et cetera, new growth. But I couldn't really see my own wreckage as life-giving at that point. All I could do was be there among the exquisite resonances of nature. Other forces were at work. Very quietly, process thinking was making its way into my life, shaping the exploration of that trauma. My sister's death at the age of 21 when I was 17. I also had an alcoholic father and a brother suffering from schizophrenia. I began to feel in the therapeutic processes the possibilities of some small newness coming out of my past. But what I found really interesting was that those delvings into interbeing with the natural world were becoming entwined with this personal work. 3 weeks after I began my first year at college, my 21-year-old sister Judy was killed by a drunken driver while riding a bicycle at night. She was a really extraordinary person. She was really angelic in her deeply loving nature, but she was also wild and likely bipolar. She and my younger sister were extremely close with her, and we placed her on a pedestal. And yet, in the summer before I went away to college, I saw confusing signs of disorder that I couldn't make sense of as a young person. We fell out. On the third week of my first semester, I received a reconciling letter from her. I wrote back within a day. I never saw her again, nor did she have a chance to read my letter. Between the sending of it and its return to me, she died, leaving a rupture, a chasm never crossed nor filled with the expression of my love for her. The shadow of that absent act wove itself into every part of my life. One afternoon, while being engaged and immersed in Whitehead, I had a compulsion to find the letter that I sent her that got returned to me. I couldn't find it. I went through hundreds of letters. My family and friends were letter writers. I have boxes of letters from that time. And I ended up reading them. It was an exhausting project. And while I didn't find that letter, I found something else. I found, instead of the repair and healing I was hoping to find in my expressions of love for her, I excavated a larger kind of love in those letters, which I could feel pulsing through them in that first year away from home. One letter from my mother stood out in particular. Now, she and I had somewhat difficult relationship. And so it was extraordinary to me to read these words and think, how had I not remembered this mother? Here's a small portion of it. And even though it doesn't seem extraordinary, taken out of context, for me, these words they shone off the page. She wrote, I love Judy, and this is 3 weeks after she died. I love Judy and tell her so every day. It's hard to explain, but she feels closer to me, and I'm confident that God does care for all of us if we let him. Judy's faith helped her through many rough spots. She discovered the great gift of giving and receiving love and knowing it was just that simple. How magnificent. Simple and magnificent. She captured the essence of my sister of love. A few weeks later, she wrote to me about almost losing her faith. Or perhaps you have to be my listener, and I have chosen you because of your great capacity for understanding. I'm not reading this because I'm boasting about myself, but more to show how sometimes we are told things that we simply can't take in. This was a feeling about something that I'd never recognized in myself, nor knew she saw it in me. How was it? And this is the issue. How was it that I did not recognize who either of us was or had the potential to be in all those years? The rereading of these letters awoke new potentials. We loved all of us, however messily. My view of everything had been too small, focused on myself, disconnected. And there's the theme again of disconnection, lack of wholeness. I've offered these deeply private expressions because of the way this writing poured out of the past and the hopefulness it gave. And for me, it seemed as if the consequent nature of God was being revealed, opened up to me in a very concrete way, thanks to those letters, physical evidence of love that was reenacted upon reading them. It was becoming something new. The abstractions of philosophy and theology and the messiness of life had found a meeting place in experience. We're getting on in time here, so I may shorten this a little bit. But for me, those letters had become divine lures, a beckoning for the possibility of some newness coming into my life, resurrectional. The experience felt like a living illustration of Whitehead's vision of God. Now we have our next slide. The wisdom of the subjective aim prehends every actuality for what it can be in such a perfected system, its sufferings, its sorrows, its failures, its triumphs, its immediacies of joy, woven by rightness of feeling into the harmony of universal feeling, which is always immediate, always many, always one, always with novel advance, moving forward and never perishing. The image under which this operative growth of God's nature is best conceived is that of a tender care that nothing can be lost. I then went on to write a poem about making a journey, using the metaphor of journeying through a natural landscape toward home, a movement within a terrain both imagined and real and sometimes frightening, a landscape that offered some clues, encouragements, wisdom, and nurture along the way. I think because of the time frame, I'm going to skip this poem because it's a long one and I want to get to the last poem. So maybe if we have time later, we can come back to it, but I think that's probably the best thing to do. But I want to come back to a quote by Whitehead, which for me was, it felt very special because I had been thinking about my own wreckage. Whitehead wrote, "God saves the world as it passes into the immediacy of his own life. It is the judgment of tenderness which loses nothing that can be saved. It is also the judgment of a wisdom which uses what in the temporal world is mere wreckage." I had thought that that's all I had was wreckage, and it became something new. And both poetry and nature helped. In the time remaining, I want to read a poem that I wrote after the first process class with Jay McDaniel. I was thinking about what Whitehead says about the feebleness of language in trying to describe his metaphysical system, to describe reality and the kind of necessary, quote, imaginative leap that would take. The searching in poetry for a container of words always fails in every poem because everything's always in flux and in changing relation. Quote, everything is everywhere at all times. And anyone who's writing a poem knows you make one choice, you go in one direction, you're not choosing another thing. You have to go on, you have to put that direction aside. Every poet asks, how much can the poem they're writing hold? And what possibilities must it let go for it to become? These are very much the questions each actual occasion must ask and decide upon. What influences and aims will it receive or let go? Here, this poem is a persona who expands, collapses, revives itself, and contracts to a moment where it sees its own reflection in the world. Poetry, like speculative philosophy, is open-ended. There will be no complete satisfaction. Another poem will spur the next one on because it needs to and can. Whitehead wrote, immediacy is the realization of the potentialities of the past. And I love this, and is the storehouse of the possibilities of the future. So this poem has a very strange shape. It keeps changing its shape all the time. It's shape shifting. It wants to be everywhere all at once. It wants to have some kind of impossible imminence. So it begins very big, and then it collapses down, and then it kind of turns itself into a map that sprawls across the page. And then it realizes that it's kind of lost its heart and questions what it is, and it becomes a very human story. And it wonders if it can heal itself. And then it dreams. And then it comes back and tries to take in the whole world again. I'm giving that to you as a sort of the structure of the poem because it's a long poem. And I thank you for listening to all of this. I think the best way is to think of this maybe as like a drama. Just listen to it as a drama. Just see how it flows over you. It's going to be, it's a lot to take in. So I want to thank you for listening. The poem tries to hold everything. The poem tries to hold everything. Hats, miles, radio waves, anchors, leptons, beating cilia, sarcophagi, Schrodinger's equation, the concept of the circle, infinity, the bones of the defeated, the Assyrians ground and scattered to make unblessable, riptides, tsunamis, sinkholes, Giotto's weeping angels vaulting out of a lapis lazuli sky over the agonies below, faucets, drain pipes, cuneiform, ghosts of burnt switchgrass bending and rising, red wolves unhowling, your mother's amputated limbs incinerated, gone up in smoke, gravitational fields fluxing, knives, derelict caves, the hungry dogs of regret circling, saguaros, jackals, silk memories of a lover's thigh, rifles, spatulas, the furnaces of cities, all flickering, touching, weaving in and out of each other until the poem teeters, hobbles, as if set on a narrow ledge, balanced on the wing of a bee. Fugitive carrying too much on its back, the poem gets down on its knees, begs you to listen, opens a trampled map, directions to everywhere and nowhere, a few words thrown off to one side, the impassable peaks of the rim of the world, then to the other side, wide river deltas flowing to a sea named after a god, coastlines too broken for wandering, cracked mud flats, forests and meadows interrupted by fire, by flood, the locations of rare spring flowers here and there, sweet little buds, if you can find them, X, X, X. And rising from sweeps of hallucinatory blue, the island of bells ringing for ships lost in a tear in the paper, the door to paradise, here and there smudgings of birds, ashes, everywhere a tissue of light, ghost stars harnessing the darkness, and the canyon ridge where your uncovered eyes follow the blood-red sun fleeing over the earth, folding back into night. Look at all this emptiness. Where is the heart of the matter? What are words for? It comes down to a crumpled piece of paper. It comes down to put on a hat, for Christ's sake, it's 10 degrees out. You can't even see through that snow. Just because you're angry, where do you think you're going with that in your pocket? God damn it, at least take these gloves. It all comes down to a poem that's afraid it can't heal anything. The poem closes its eyes and dreams a poultice of honey and herbs, calendula, plantain, wrapped around and around by warm fingers, by voices, by fire. Lying in the dark, the poem remembers it was once a song carried from body to body. How it longs for a long drink of water, an ocean, sip of an ocean. Silly girl, silly poem, ravenous world. Shh. Is the poem dreaming or awake? It feels a music riding on the tongue, old, new, tasted and swallowed and sung again and again, lonely, tender, infinite, broken. The poem gets up, stretches its arms toward the sky, as if it knows it doesn't have to sing alone, words it never owned. Look, a cloud of witnesses approaching, librettists, arrangers, Singers hauling snare drums, harpsichords, 12-string guitars into the street. Come, calls the poem to the harpist and bell ringer, sirens screaming, to wood thrush and prairie grouse, to the bent man moaning over chains and bones. The all-day unheard silent weeping of the nurse who lifted her dead patient alone onto the gurney, gone weight of warm wrist pulse, chest rising, eyes open, closed. Dark matter heaves and swells. The baby practices breathing inside its mother's womb. Snow falls into crevices of rock. The foxes fur. Now or never, says the poem. Hot as spilled blood, cool as snow, it rips like a sax into the night, bends down low and croons to the child, turning his burning cheek to the pillow. Dear one, stay, I'll do anything. Out of breath, the poem stands beside the woman at the window, wondering if the universe hears her. Oh, please, below, dream of an impossible moon in this small house, this room. I'm done. That's it.
Kathleen, that was breathtaking. Thank you so very much for what you've shared with us. I think we needed a bit of silence anyway, in order just to breathe in your words. Thank you.